Okay. All right. I believe we can start. So, welcome all to this event run by the Indigenous Studies Discussion Group, or ISDG, at the University of Cambridge. Thank you for joining us today. This is our first event of the academic year, and we're very excited for many, many interesting panels and discussions, which we hope to facilitate through this platform. We are grateful to the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities and the Cambridge Heritage Research Center for their support of this group and for making this event possible. The ISDG is a graduate student-led initiative started in 2019 with the objectives of 1, promoting scholarship by and about Indigenous peoples across disciplines and spaces to be a regular feature of the intellectual life of Cambridge, and 2, promoting and sharing the discussion of insights and ideas pertaining to Indigenous studies across peoples, disciplines, times, and geographies. My name is Christos Nicolaou, and I am a second-year PhD student at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. My PhD focuses on the distribution of religious artifacts in urban contexts in the Hellenistic Far East and how that pertains to ideas of hybridity, especially in the realm of religion. We are very excited today. We have a term-long theme called Discovering Britain through Discourses of Indigeneity, and we are excited for the first part of our conference for the first panel, which will concern the pre-British Empire period, from the Cheddar Man to the late medieval period. British history is rife with change. Ethnic, social, and linguistic shifts have indelibly marked its present day. While discourses of native or original Britons in popular media are nothing new, with the surge in topics of indigeneity across disciplines, some scholars have begun to apply Indigenous Studies theoretical frameworks to understanding different contexts, including British history. Such frameworks are a rather recent development and have drawn both interest and critique. Our panel aims to unpack some of these approaches through discussion on pre-Imperial Britain, from the Cheddar Man to the Medieval Age. Our speakers will cover various topics from periods of pre-modern Britain and participate in a fruitful discussion on the utility and validity of these frameworks in the pre-Empire British context. And I will introduce our panelists. Professor Alex Wolff is senior lecturer in the School of History in the University of Glasgow. His main interests lie in the history of Britain and Ireland before the coming of the Normans, with a bias towards the earlier part of the period, circa 400 to 900 BCE. Particular interests include ethnic interaction and language shift, the development of political structures, and social and economic history. Further of these islands, he has less well-developed interest in late Roman and early post-Roman Gaul and in Scandinavia in the first millennium CE. Dr. Thomas Booth is a postdoctoral research fellow at Harvard University. He is currently working as a postdoctoral research associate on the Wellcome-funded project, Human Adaptation to Diet and Infectious Disease Loads from the Origins of Agriculture to the Present. His own research is concerned with a microstructural analysis of diagenesis in ancient human bone, particularly the relationship between bioerosion and early post-mortem taphonomic processes. This research also has applications to survival of DNA in ancient bone. And Dr. Ben Guy is a research associate in the School of Welsh at Cardiff University. He specializes in the language, literature, and history of medieval Wales. His interests range across early Welsh poetry, historical writing, and manuscripts, as well as early insular history. He also has a special interest in medieval Welsh texts that convey contemporary political views through representations of the Welsh past. He has conducted extensive research on the tradition of Welsh genealogical writing from the early medieval to the early modern period, and this is the subject of his monograph. He's currently a research associate working on the earliest poems of the Welsh Merlin tradition. And before we begin, we would like to offer some housekeeping notes. Please keep your microphone turned off. The event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on and off as you prefer. By remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you consent to be recorded. The recording will be available on the Crash website and on the ISDG YouTube channel soon after the event. During the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat or to me, and we will read it aloud. If you want to ask your question in person, please indicate that in the chat. Captioning has been enabled for this event. If you would like to have captioning, you can select it at the bottom of your screen. Please note the captions are provided by Zoom, and Crash cannot be held responsible for the accuracy. Rest assured, you will be able to revisit the event recording on YouTube. We are doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event. It goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and each other throughout the event. And I think it's a great time for me to leave it to our panelists to start their engaging discussion. We will start through historically chronological order. So I believe Thomas Booth will go first. So take it away, Thomas.
Hey, okay, I think you need to enable screen sharing here. You might need to make me a host.
One moment.
All right. Nice one. I think that's what. Yes. Okay, so as it says on here, I'm actually now at the Francis Crick Institute. But I can understand why it came up as me still being with the NHM and Harvard, because they still haven't taken down my profile on there. So I'm still up there, and that's the most prominent thing that comes up when you Google my name. But yes, anyway, I'm at the Francis Crick Institute now, working on an ancient DNA project that's looking to produce 10,000 1,000 ancient genomes from across prehistory and history in Britain, covering the last 10,000 years, to look at ancestry change and selection. And when I was asked to do this, I thought about what I could talk about, and really in terms of the discourse around ancient DNA, the idea of indigeneity in Britain specifically is quite problematic in the way that it is utilized by the far right. So I thought this, in terms of the way that they take the discourse around indigenous peoples in various parts of the world, and try to use that to promote a far right sort of white exceptionalist agenda in Britain. And how the ancient DNA results are they try to co-opt ancient DNA results into that. So to begin with, I'll hopefully, let's see if I can play this video, which gives a sense of what I'm talking about.
There was an ice age here. There were no people here in the ice age because they couldn't live in the ice.
Let's not go too far. Let's not go too far back.
No, listen.
We'll be here all night if we started the ice age.
David, Nick Griffin calls his party for Indigenous Ice Age. Am I wrong?
The people largely descended.
All right, okay.
When the ice melted.
Okay, when the ice melted 17,000 years ago, people came up from.
Okay, that was the main part that I wanted to highlight. So this was an appearance by Nick Griffin, who was then the leader of the far-right British National Party, on Question Time, where he was making this explicit association between the indigenous peoples of Britain and being descended from people who first colonized Britain or settled Britain at the end of the last Iron Age. And the point was then, and now to some extent, he's using this language and discourse around indigeneity and colonial context and appropriating it to and combining it with DNA analysis, which at the time did suggest, it was very weak DNA analysis, but the DNA analysis that was there did suggest that populations typical of Britain were descended from those who first migrated to Britain at the end of the last ice age, around 18,000 years ago. But he was using this in a way that defining the British population as being this genetically definable, coherent whole that was under threat and should be afforded special rights, using the similar sort of languages that are used about genuine indigenous peoples. And I think this sort of represents a blurring of the various different possible definitions of indigeneity. You know, you've got a biological sense of indigeneity, which is essentially where a species evolved, which in this case for humans would be in Africa. There's sort of a colloquial understanding of indigeneity, which has its problems, of people who have some kind of predominant continuous legacy in a particular place, but not always, such as, for instance, in the Sami in Fennoscandia, who, in terms of their presence in Fennoscandia, have been there for as long as people, more typical, who are typically most typically Scandinavian, and the way that these all are all blended together to form an idea of the indigenous British with a genetic underpinning, that it is about the genetics, which is the way of defining indigenous British people. But it's important to say, it's important to sort of go back to the fact that indigenous peoples' views of DNA and the way it defines peoples are highly variable, and particularly in it's variable, but often it doesn't come into their definition of who and who isn't indigenous. And principally, Kim Tolbear in North America, a native researcher in North America, has hit out about the idea that DNA is not a principal or primary way of defining who is indigenous in North America, and that there are many people in North America who carry genetic ancestries derived from indigenous Americans but are not indigenous American. And the most obvious example of that is the sort of furore over Elizabeth Warren sort of calling herself Native American just because she had some DNA derived from indigenous American groups. And similarly, genetics should have no role, it should be stated sort of from the outset, no role in defining identity, indigeneity and rights in modern Britain. So since that clip I showed, there's been a revolution in archaeogenetics, the study of ancient DNA from humans, and we now have a much better idea, and we have much more powerful techniques in which we can look at the DNA of ancient people, and we have a pretty good idea of the genetic history of Britain through prehistory. So there's a paper that's actually not out yet, so I'm giving you a slight sneak preview that will be coming out in the next few months, looking at populations who inhabited Britain during just after the last ice age, so from around 16,000 BC, when Britain was still connected to continental Europe. And Britain was inhabited by groups that had this particular type of genetic ancestry, sometimes called Goya Q2 ancestry. Goya Q2 it's the site where you get the earliest type of this genetic ancestry appear. And these genetic ancestors relatively distant from those people who live in Britain and Europe today. So this population who inhabit Britain here essentially doesn't exist anymore because of later genetic changes. During the course of the Upper Paleolithic, there was migrations into Britain which largely replaced the people who had been living there previously, introducing these genetic ancestries known as Western hunter-gatherer or Villa-Brunner ancestries. And these are the populations that they probably abandoned Britain during the Younger Dryas when there was a return to glacial conditions, but then returned to it and reoccupy it during the from the beginning of the Holocene to around 4000 BC. So you can see these proportions on the right hand side are reflecting different types of these ancestries. So the Goya Q2 ancestry is common from this site Goff's Cave, which is around from around 12,000 BC, and then Kendrick's Cave from around 11,000 BC. You can see it totally shifts to this Villa-Brunner genetic ancestries, which then persists, and then the rest of these burials in chronological order all the way through to around 7,000 BC. So you can see that there's a big shift in ancestries. But again, this new population that arrives, and this is the population that Cheddar Man belongs to, these Western European hunter-gatherers, are still genetically quite distant from populations who typically inhabit Britain today. Going to Cheddar Man specifically, so this was a man that died around 8,300 BC and was buried in Goff's Cave in Cheddar Gorge, Somerset. So when we look at the pigmentation genetics, in the way that genetic variants linked to pigmentation vary amongst world populations, and sort of use that to predict the pigmentation of Cheddar Man, he comes back as having dark, it's quite wide range of dark to very dark skin pigmentation, dark brown or black hair, and blue green eyes. And this is similar to other Mesolithic populations of Europe. Essentially, most of the populations that were inhabiting Western Europe at the time had similar pigmentation genetics, and suggesting that they would have had dark skin but potentially light colored eyes. And this is backed up by, there's been evidence for recent intense selection in the last 5,000 years for selection on genetic variants linked to lighter skin pigmentation. So, you know, that extreme selection tells you that they must have had darker skin previously. Otherwise, what is the phenotype that this selective pressure is acting upon? And these pigmentation characteristics reflect the fact that, again, this population no longer exists in an unadmixed form. And while they are to some extent ancestral to populations who inhabit Europe and typically inhabit Britain today, they're also, because of later admixtures and migrations, relatively genetically distant. So sort of, to give you an example, people who typically inhabit South Asia today are closer to genetically to living people in Britain than living people in Britain are close genetically to the Mesolithic populations of Britain, if you see what I mean. That's how sort of big the genetic distance is, in relative terms. After this, you have a number of other major genetic shifts that occur in Britain and the population of Britain through the Holocene. So 4000 BC, there's the arrival of Neolithic groups carrying this early European farmer ancestry, which has a distant connection to Neolithic populations of Anatolia, and this produces a 99% ancestry shift in Britain. Around 2500 BC, there's the arrival of Bell-Beaker-associated groups carrying Western steppe herder ancestries, which are distantly descended from populations who lived on the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Around 1000 BC, you then have arrivals of groups probably coming from lots of different places, but with a particular focus on southern France, which again produces about a 50% ancestry shift in southern Britain, with a sort of a diminishing impact the further north and west that you go. And there was a recent paper a couple of weeks ago that showed that in the early medieval period, you have groups arriving carrying ancestors from northern continental Europe, both from probably Frankish parts of France, but also Anglo-Saxon parts of what is now Saxon parts of what is now Germany. At least these are affecting, which produces a large ancestry shift in eastern England as well, and shifts elsewhere, but you know, attenuating as you go further west and north. And there's also another substantial shift that happens at some time between 800 AD and the present day, which might be related to migrations to and interactions with groups from present-day France. This is specifically in what is now England. And the changes in pigmentation that have occurred between Cheddar Man and now has been a result of both these migrations, where people carrying different pigmentation genetics have migrated into Britain, but also as a result of selection in Britain, where there's been selective pressure for certain pigmentation characteristics very recently. So there's coming to modern DNA. Is there a way that modern DNA can be used to define some indigenous British population? I mean, the way that academic studies and genetic ancestry testing companies produce their source populations is by, there's lots of different ways of doing it, but usually they get people who either define themselves for the case of Britain as white British, or they documented their great grandparents or grandparents come from a particular region. And this is a way of trying to get at genetic variation that existed in the past. But also these populations are trimmed algorithmically. So these are actually probably a conservative estimate of past genetic diversity. This excludes a significant minority proportion of people who would define themselves and would be accepted as being white British. You know, this isn't actually defining anything coherent. It's just a useful methodological practice of trying to get some sense of the genetic variation in a place back in time. It's not in any way a useful way of defining who belongs in a particular place in the modern world. And it's also, in this context, important to bear in mind that genealogical ancestry and genetic ancestry are not the same thing. So this chart on the right-hand side shows when you go back 17 generations, the red bars are all of your genealogical ancestors. The blue bars represent the proportion of those ancestors from whom you've inherited any DNA. So when you get back to a certain point, basically you inherit DNA in chunks, and eventually get to the point where you have more genealogical ancestors than you have chunks of DNA. When that happens, you essentially start to shed genetic ancestors from whom you are genealogically descended, but from whom you have inherited no DNA. But because that, from a probabilistic perspective, more of a genealogical ancestor, if your recent ancestors are from a particular part of the world, because then more of your genealogical ancestors will also have been from that part of the world, even if you haven't inherited DNA from them. From a probabilistic perspective, you will inherit more DNA from ancestors in that region, and so will essentially your genetic ancestry will reflect the population history of the place where your recent ancestors came from. But yeah, the intuitive idea that your genetic ancestry somehow translates into some all-encompassing idea of your genealogical ancestry is false, so all of this really pushes against this idea that there's a straightforward way in which you can in fact define indigenous populations of Britain in a way through genetics, even if it was a morally ideologically sort of desirable thing to do. It's impossible. Despite the change that there's been in the last 10 years in terms of the vintage of British populations being reduced to essentially sort of 18,000 years ago to less than 2,000 years to some extent, people with far-right leanings still are persisting in using genetics evidence and combining it with this sort of indigenous dialogues to sort of define an indigenous people of Britain who are under threat, who should be afforded more rights than people who are not indigenous, or in various ways. And they can't let the genetics not fit, so essentially they just change their ideas. Every time there's a new study come along, they just change their ideas to fit what is indigenous, because they start from the idea that there's an indigenous population of Britain who are the white people of Britain, and then they sort of build the genetics into that. And again, this is just to say that the way that sort of this indigenous discourse is misappropriated is dangerous, because it can sound plausible to people, and often the way that the ancient DNA results are received by the public and media are often interpreted in these terms. And that's it for what I was going to say. So hopefully that was interesting and not too depressing. Thanks.
Thank you, Thomas. Now we will move on to our next panelist.
Yeah, thank you very much. And that was the perfect background as well to the things I want to go on talk about in my talk. So thank you for the invitation to speak from the organisers. I should say perhaps at the outset that indigeneity is not usually a concept that I bring to my research work, but it's been an interesting one to think about for the purposes of today's session. And all I'm really going to try and do in my paper is just to present a few ideas more linked to the discourse of indigeneity than to anything else, to hopefully prompt discussion afterwards. Okay, so I thought I'd start out with some maps. So these maps show population change in Britain and Ireland over time, and I think they represent the way that many people in the public imagination tend to think about the history of Britain and Ireland via the kind of movement and arrival of various peoples, pushing peoples who were previously here back further north and further west. In fact, what we're seeing here is a map of the changes in squirrel population over time, with the arrival of the grey squirrels from the south and the east, pushing back the red squirrels further north and west. But this same kind of thinking often underlies the presentation of history, particularly in the early Middle Ages. And if we just compare that with this map, and I could have chosen any number of maps of this kind, this happened to be one in a historical atlas on the bookshelf in my office. You can see the same kind of colouring in of the map of different groups coming from different places and pushing back other people is prominent in the way that this idea is conceived. Now, of course, there are some crucial differences between squirrels and people. One of the key ones is that red and grey squirrels are in fact different species, and so that they're not mutually compatible, they can't interbreed, and which is why they're kept entirely separate. People, of course, are not at all like that, and during this kind of period where we have new groups of settlers coming from the continent and bringing with them a Germanic language, the process that was happening within Britain was one of complex social, cultural, and linguistic change, rather than one of two mutually incompatible species of squirrel butting up against each other and one pushing the other one back. Now, the reality of this period is very complicated, and it's not really what we're going to be going into here. What we're talking about instead is the discourse surrounding this. So we'll be moving away from the complexities underlying these kind of social and cultural changes, and considering really the way that they were thought about over quite a long time period. So what discourse is it that I'm talking about? Well, this is the idea that the indigenous or original, I suppose, in a sense, inhabitants of Britain are the Britons, which is the term used for essentially the Welsh and other closely related peoples, rather than the incoming Anglo-Saxon or English groups who displaced the Britons in major parts of lowland Britain. So I think this is an idea which it's fair to say is very common and widespread nowadays, and it has been widespread for an awfully long time. I could have taken any number of kind of pithy examples of this discourse to show to you, but just to pick a few at random, really. We've got this passage from Gerald of Wales in the 12th century, from his description of Wales, where he articulates exactly this idea. So he says that the Britons who were left alive, this is after the Anglo-Saxon invasion, took refuge in these parts in Wales when the Saxons first occupied the island, and they have never been completely subdued since, either by the English or the Normans. Those who retreated to the southern corner of the island could not continue their resistance, for their territory has no natural protection. It is called Cornwall after their leader, Coroneus. There was a third group of Britons left unconquered, and these occupied Brittany in southern Gaul. So clearly Gerald is subscribing to the squirrel model of historical change in Britain. And if you think about the language of taking refuge and retreating, he's imagining two mutually incompatible groups of peoples, where the grey squirrel Anglo-Saxons are coming over and pushing back the red squirrel Britons into the west of the island. This kind of idea really does continue for an awfully long time in this kind of form. And as in Gerald's take here, it's often combined with particular ideas about the legendary past of Britain, arising in particular from the very influential work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, written in this same century. So just fast forwarding to the 16th century, we have the same idea exactly articulated in Humphrey Lloyd's work on the history of Wales, Chronica Waliae, finished in 1559, where he's describing the kind of essentially prehistoric past of Britain based on the ideas of legendary history that Geoffrey Monmouth was responsible for. And he ends by saying that this is the Welsh, have kept the same country and language 2,690 odd years, without commixture with any other nation, especially in North Wales, as it shall hereafter appear. So I think he's quite nicely articulating here a discourse of indigeneity, the idea that people in Wales, and particularly North Wales, are really the original indigenous people who've preserved this language and customs over a very long period of time. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this kind of idea is, I think, in one form or another, still quite widespread in popular imagination. But that isn't to say that this discourse hasn't changed and evolved over time, as of course many other ideas and concepts have. So I want to spend the rest of this time thinking about how this kind of discourse in the Middle Ages differed maybe from what we might think about it today. So one way in which, at least in the way that we can see it articulated, past descriptions of this idea differed from what we might think of nowadays, is that the majority of descriptions of this kind of discourse from the past are being written by learned clerical elites who are steeped in Christian biblical history. And it's very much within that kind of intellectual framework that they are situating this type of discourse. So to illustrate what I mean by this, I've given you here a kind of summary of key points taken from quite a well-known 9th century work written in North Wales called Historia Britonum, or History of the Britons. This work goes to some pains to identify when the various peoples of Britain and Ireland arrived here for the first time, although it does so within the framework of Christian history. So within that framework, of course, nobody is indigenous in the sense that they've been there from the beginning, because all people come from Adam and from the patriarch. So everyone has to arrive somewhere for the first time. And so that's what sets people off, or set people off like the author of this work, wondering when it was then that certain peoples arrived in Britain and Ireland. And the author comes up with this particular scheme where, lo and behold, the Britons arrive first of all, and then quite neatly each of the other peoples arrives in successive ages. The author is dealing with a chronological scheme known as the 6 Ages of the World, which was very popular and widespread during the Middle Ages, particularly because of the work of St. Augustine, which divided world history essentially into 6 ages as defined by particular biblical epochs. So here we have the Britons arriving in the 3rd age, the Irish in the 4th, the Picts in the 5th, and the Saxons, of course, last of all, in the 6th age. And these various arrivals, the author tries to date by reference to particular events in biblical history or in the history of Rome. And so you can see this is the arrangement he comes up with, which I don't hopefully need to stress has absolutely nothing to do with real prehistory. This is an attempt as a construction of the past, based on on the thinking of the time. And I suppose just to emphasize quite how differently, or how constructed this was, we can compare this construction with similar attempts among the voluminous writings of early Ireland, where one finds a somewhat different arrangement. And depending on which version one reads, one can see the Irish arriving in Ireland first, and the Britons then being portrayed as a kind of offshoot of one of the early groups arriving in Ireland. So there were very different ways of arranging the same kind of ideas. Another way in which this type of scheme is clearly contrived is the way that we have here such different histories ascribed to the Britons and to the Picts. And the Picts were a people who lived in what is now essentially eastern Scotland, and they can be seen to appear in the historical record during the early centuries of the Christian era, during the Roman occupation of the south of the island. Now, when the Romans first arrived in Britain, they didn't distinguish between what we might call the indigenous inhabitants of the north and south of the island. They were just all Britons. But it's during the Roman occupation of lowland Britain that there emerges this perceived distinction between those inhabitants of the Roman province of Britain who continued to think of themselves as Britons, and the people to the north who were not undergoing the kinds of cultural and social changes associated with the Roman Empire. And they came to be perceived as being different and were termed Picti in Latin, meaning painted people, or Picts. And this is really the origins of the idea that the Picts were a separate ethnic group from the Britons. And certainly by the 9th century, but by the time this author was working, there would have been no question amongst him and his contemporaries that these were entirely separate peoples, even though that perception of difference only arose relatively recently in the past. Okay, and then the last thing I want to just draw your attention to is the significance of naming for this discourse, and the names carried by particularly important places, and especially the names of the islands concerned. So just to talk for a moment about the name of Britain, I think this is one area, again, where the discourse of indigeneity, and in particular the indigeneity of the Welsh or the Britons, has very much changed over time. Because nowadays, Britain, and indeed Britishness, is its own complex, which isn't linked directly to either Englishness or Welshness in any kind of simple way. There's a whole set of complex relationships which have emerged in much more recent centuries, and which are not really the subject of this seminar. But that was not really the case in the past, in the Middle Ages, and particularly the early Middle Ages, where the name of the island of Britain, and also the term Britons, was much more closely linked to the people that we now call the Welsh. And that is reflected in the way that the discourse of the Britons being the original peoples of the island is presented. And to give you two contrasting ways in which this could be done here on the slides, firstly, we have a statement made by a Welsh author writing in Latin in the 13th century, who's commenting on the name of the island. This author says that whoever has read or known the history of the Britons, may he have understood that this name, Brutus, is a Trojan name, but one corrupted by the Latins. For in the language of the Trojans, or of the Britons who derive their origins from the Trojans, he is not called Brutus, but Predus, or Predus, something that is understood properly up to this day. Britain, which draws its name from Brutus, is called Prydain by the Britons. So what the author is saying is that not only is the name of the island derived from the name of the first leader of the Britons who arrived in Britain, Brutus, not only that, but also the Britons, or the Welsh here, preserve the original version of that name, because the Welsh word for Britain is Prydain, and according to this author at least, and we should say that this is not really true, but according to this author, this better reflects the original Trojan name that the Britons brought with them in the name of their leader. So in that sense, it's kind of doubly original. A very different take on the name of the islands is found in a number of other sources from England and indeed from continental Europe across the Middle Ages. And an early manifestation of that is found in the Chronicle of the West Saxon nobleman Athelweald, writing in the 10th century. Athelweald comments that Britannia is now called Anglia, or England, because it's taking the name of the victors. And what he means by this is that because the English had succeeded in conquering and ruling over a large proportion of the island of Britain, and vanquishing therefore the Britons, the island should no longer be called Britain, but instead it should be called England. Of course, today, especially in places like Wales, people are very keen to make a distinction between Britain and England. But this distinction is very much elided in this way of thinking by Athelweald and many others like him, especially in the Middle Ages, where England is essentially a synonym for Britain. Indeed, England is the successor of Britain in that kind of sense. Okay, I'll stop there then, but hopefully I've given some ideas that we can bring then to the discussion later on. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Ben. And now we will move on to Professor Alex Wolff, who I made a mistake in the beginning. Is from University of St. Andrews, not University of Glasgow. Sorry about that. And please take it away.
That's okay. I know we all look the same from that distance. Scotland looks very small on the map, and we're all on top of each other. I don't actually have a PowerPoint, I'm afraid, because I was slightly worried about overlap, and so I wanted to keep myself flexible because Ben and I have very similar specializations. So I'll sort of follow on from where he left off. You'll remember that he mentioned about the biblical model of history that dominated ideas of writing and scholarship and thinking about history. And of course, in that model, all human beings are descended from the three sons of Noah who survived the Great Flood. And so the first part of any national history required people to explain how their ancestors got to where their people are now from Mount Ararat in Armenia. So the first part of any history is going to be the journey from Armenia to the present. And that immediately destroys any ideas of indigeneity, as we've heard from Ben. And this model is laid out in the book of Genesis in a section known as the Table of Nations, which it does explain for many of the nations in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, how they all relate to different sons of Noah. And from this, it was possible to infer that all Europeans were descended from Japheth. And so we then have this series of stories explaining how, as we've heard, the Britons were originally refugees from Troy, came via Italy and southern France. The Picts came from Scythia, stopping off on their way at Poitou in France, because that's called Pictavia in Latin, and therefore must have the same origin, according to the etymology of medieval writers. And one of the factors in this idea of the spreading out of people, and particularly the sort of secondary colonization, once you have people fighting against each other, is what's known as providential history, the idea that a nation is rewarded with a prosperous land and country because it's behaved well in the sight of God. And so to some extent, the taking of land was seen as showing that one had, to use a modern term, manifest destiny, to own that land. That, of course, comes to the biblical idea of the promised land of Canaan being given to the Israelites, even though they had it already had occupants, the Canaanites. Of course, we now know that Israelites are all descended from Canaanites, but that's a story for geneticists, not for writers of history. And so this model of providential history is one that people bore in mind. And so that even when people have been settled in a country for a long while, they didn't necessarily think of themselves as indigenous. And coming from the 10th century, we have a poem, The Battle of Brunanburh, which is written into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in 937. It's written slightly before that chronicler Athelweard, whom Ben ended up quoting. And it celebrates a great victory by the nascent English. The West Saxons and the Mercians were in the process of unifying the English into a single kingdom. And they're fighting off foreign invaders, principally the Dublin Norse, led by King Olaf, and the Scots, led by King Constantine. And they're defending their homeland, and it's a great national victory. Yet even then, they don't make claims to indigeneity. So the very end of the poem reads, "There had not been on this island ever yet of the slaying of people before this, by the sword's edge, as book tells us, or old wits, since from the east hither Angles and Saxons came up over the broad ocean, seeking Britain, bold battlesmiths, defeating the Romans, noble, eager for glory, got a country." So even in this great epic of national defense, they're still saying, but we came from somewhere else as well. We were invaders who won in a battle, just as these people did. And probably the message to be taken from that is that victory goes to those whom God blessed. They were given this land by God, and the attempted invasion and conquest of it by the Hiberno Norse and by the Scots will come to nothing because God is not on their side. And so in that sense, indigeneity isn't important. In some ways, that might be more problematic. The Canaanites were indigenous, supposedly, but they had lost God's mercy and God's grace, and therefore they lost their land. So indigeneity in itself is not an argument. And these are the models taken for understanding the right to settle land right through the Middle Ages and to some extent into the early modern period. And since being asked to take part in this debate, I've been trying to think, well, how and when did this change? And we do get some discussions in the Enlightenment that seem to raise questions of indigeneity. And one in particular that Scottish historians often bring up and find quite entertaining, because it's so ludicrous, is an idea put forward by John Pinkerton in 1791. Pinkerton was an antiquarian who wrote a lot of things, most of them actually crazy, but at the time he was not necessarily thought to be quite so mad as he is now. But he was very well thought of in circles of Enlightenment thinking in Scotland at the time. And he argued that Lowland Scots, the people who spoke the Scots language, which some people think is a dialect of English, though of course it's actually a completely separate language, it's just very closely related to English, but the speakers of the Scots language, the Lowland Scots, were indigenous, and that they were ethnically Germanic, going all the way back. He used the word Gothic rather than Germanic, but he meant what we call Germanic, and therefore they were sort of equal to the English. They had a long history, and Gaelic-speaking Highlanders were recent arrivals from Ireland, and that the Picts had in fact been Gothic or Germanic speaking and had always been there. And what he was trying to do was to suggest that the Protestant, lowland, urbanized, mercantile culture of his part of Scotland was not the product of relatively recent transformation, which is what we think, in fact, what most historians up to Pinkerton's time thought, and that language shift away from Gaelic in the course of the later Middle Ages, but that he wanted to claim this was indigenous. And this seems to me to be something that does spring out of the Enlightenment world. And I'm trying to think about why indigeneity should become more significant to that point. It occurs to me that it's probably to some extent about ideas about sovereignty coming from the people. And that if sovereignty lies with the people, then the ordinary people and the land and the people together make the polity. And that's not something that we would necessarily have seen at an earlier period. So going back to the Central Middle Ages, the Regnum Scotorum, the Scottish kingdom, dominated a part of Britain that eventually was more or less coextensive with modern Scotland. But it was well known, certainly in the sort of 11th, 12th, 13th centuries, that the Scotti, the ethnic Scots, were only a relatively small portion of that population. Varied over time, but about half the population, say in the 13th century. At the beginning of the 13th century would have been people who would have thought of themselves as Scots, spoken Gaelic, and it was their kingdom, but there were lots of people who lived in that kingdom who were not Scots. So, for example, Adam of Dryborough, writing about the location of his own monastery, which is nowadays in the Scottish borders, described it as in terra Anglorum in regnum Scotorum, in England, in the Scottish kingdom. And this reflects a much wider view that you see very widely across kingdoms and polities in the early and central Middle Ages. But it was taken for granted that large portions of the population, often the majority, did not belong to the ruling group who gave their name to the polity. So you see this worked out in Ireland in complex ideas about base population groups and noble population groups within provincial kingdoms and so on. And these are legitimized by differing descent patterns suggested to them, or that they're linked to different phases of invasion and colonization of Ireland in prehistory. But you see similar things elsewhere. You see this happening in a place like Saxony. And interestingly, in a text from Norway from the 13th century, we also see about a three-tiered level of ethnic intervention. The Norwegian nobility and the local kings of Norway have been descended from two brothers called Nor and Gor, who had come from the far north. They'd suppressed a people who at that point were what we would call indigenous. We don't have their origin in the narrative. But then the kings of Norway as a national kingdom came from Sweden and had a different ethnic origin. And it was important to keep that ethnic origin distinct. They took wives from the descendants of Nor and Gor, but they themselves in the male line were a different group. And this kind of tiered idea of ethnic identity within polities is something very common in the ancient and medieval world. And that's why I think that the emphasis on indigeneity is largely tied into Enlightenment, post-Reformation, or perhaps even late Renaissance ideas about sovereignty being invested in the people and moving towards what we think of as romantic nationalist ideas of states, which brings us back neatly to Thomas's points about Nick Griffin's approach. The idea that was summed up neatly by the Nazis as ein Sprach, ein Volk, ein Staat, one language, one people, one state, is not an idea that would necessarily have made sense to the rulers of 13th century Scotland or 12th century Germany. These sorts of ideas are really ideas that only became possible once people began to think about expanding the franchise and having participatory democracy of some sort. And that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Dr. Wolf. That was everyone had very, very fascinating presentations and touched on very, very interesting topics, some of them very topical. I'm going to start by asking if the audience has any questions. Are there any questions in the chat or that people would like to raise? No, it seems okay. In which case, I think I'll go first with a question to Dr. Wolf about. So I was fascinated by when you mentioned the Norwegian kings who tried to make themselves distinct. So how did they base their? How would they? Where did they base their sovereignty over their kingdom based purely on conquest, or was there another form of justification or legitimation for it?
I think it was purely on conquest, and they probably emphasized their distinct ethnic origin in order to make it impossible for native magnates, if you like, to compete with them. If you had to be a member of the Yngling dynasty arriving from Sweden to be a genuine member of the royal family, then no local magnate could seize power. I think that's the model, is that you want to create at least a mythological difference. I mean, in fact, Swedes and Norwegians are pretty hard to tell apart today. And we're talking about people who, by the time of the unification of Norway, had, even if we believe their origin legend, been living in Norway for 6 or 7 generations. So they weren't any different from the other Norwegian rulers in reality, but they wanted to make out that they had something that made them distinct that other people couldn't claim an origin to. Does that make sense?
Yep, it's a very interesting, like, seeing the contradiction between like later, more Enlightenment / romantic nationalism ideas of how to justify the state.
I think so. I think it probably ultimately, although these texts were written down in the Christian period, it may ultimately have some origin in ideas that you get, again, pretty much globally, that kings are descended from gods or the god or God in some way. And, you get this with Egyptian pharaohs, but you also get this with the Anglo-Saxon kings who claim descent from Woden, and so on. And so that I think the function of that is for that reason. One of the things that always used to puzzle me or intrigue me when I was a kid reading Greek mythology was that Heracles was both the brother of Perseus and also his great grandson. I think I've got that right. And I used to think, oh, that's a bit weird. And what you find some people doing, and one of my PhD students was recently trying to do this, was trying to work out when did the Anglo-Saxons think Woden lived by using the pedigrees. But the point about that, the point of these two elements coming together is that it's not that they thought Woden was a real person or they thought that Zeus was sleeping with people in a particular decade. The idea is that when you have somebody who's just one of us, but is amazingly significant, so they become the Regius Professor of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic or whatever, they have to explain that they're really the illegitimate child of some earlier Regius Professor of Anglo-Saxon, Norse and Celtic, in order to legitimize that and to explain why they and none of the other candidates whose CVs were apparently just as good managed to get that job. And so that's the function of divine descent. It's a way of showing that even if your CV is exactly the same in every other way, there's something that makes you different and that legitimizes your inequality. And to some extent, we have that today. We've just gone through the funeral and the accession of monarchs in Britain. And these are people who have a completely weird lifestyle, and it's entirely based on their claim to descent from Cheddar and ultimately from Woden. Prince Charles could claim his descent from Woden. That's one of the, that could be easily charted out. So I think that's what's going on here.
Thank you. We have a question in the chat by Oliver. Question: notions of indigeneity are and have been so powerful and interesting for political purposes, especially far right, as we saw during Dr. Booth's presentation. From your experiences, how can academics be effective and careful when their work can be used for these political purposes so readily? How can we make sure our research is not misinterpreted or misused?
Shall I go first on that one?
Yes, please.
Yeah, because this is a persistent question with ancient DNA research, particularly because it's ripe for these kind of abuses. And, you know, it's taken a while for geneticists generally to come around to the idea that they should probably try to, that their work's being misappropriated in this way to begin with, but then they should try as far as they can to prevent it. It's impossible to do it entirely because, you know, if you get to a certain point where the far right will just ignore the bits that are inconvenient and just play up the bits that they like. And you saw that happening with this recent Anglo-Saxon England genetics paper that came out a couple of weeks ago, that certain parts were played up, certain parts were sort of played down in order to fit the narrative, and that they'll prefer. But you can do things like try and put in statements there which anticipate how it might be, how your results might be received, and try to counter it either in the papers themselves or in press releases, or trying to when you're doing science communication and saying what your paper doesn't say about things like culture and ethnicity and sort of bounded categories of genetic categories of humans that are directly descendants of people alive today. But yeah, you're limited because, you know, in the end, all of this data that we produce is made publicly available so that anyone can go and analyze it, and people do, and then just represent it with their own sort of spin on the results. So we just mainly have to try and inoculate the general population against that kind of influence, rather than try to sort of absolutely protect our work from being misappropriated, because there's nothing we can do about that to some extent.
Does anyone else have any more comments on the matter?
Maybe I could add something there. It's very, I mean, it's just to some extent different working in a historical field, but this is something I've encountered having written a book about, well, a book with genealogy in the title, which is really a study of texts in the Middle Ages, essentially. But as a consequence of that, I'm often contacted by people with their genealogical queries about whether or not they're linked to this or that Welsh prince. And many of those aren't entirely innocent types of queries. Some of them are a bit less so, depending on what kind of ideology is underpinning it. And I think one of the problems with either trying to, as it were, re-explain something to that kind of person, or indeed to anyone else, is that we've always got to bear in mind that in our privileged positions as academics, we have spent years accessing and understanding frameworks for understanding quite complex ideas about these types of problems that your average member of the public hasn't had, and so you can't just expect them to understand what you're talking about on the same kind of level as your colleagues. And so it's finding that alternative way to explain something in a simpler way, and also when writing academically, to anticipate what someone who hasn't had that kind of training might make of it. It's hard, I think, to see that, but you can't just send that you know, a member of the public the kind of answer or the kind of explanation that you'd send a colleague, because they're working from a very different starting point, and that's the same, I think, across all academic fields, really.
Yes, I think I'd agree with all of that. And I think one other key thing is we've got to think very hard about terminology and whether or not the wider public understands that terminology. So, for example, as social scientists, we're used to thinking of ethnicity as a social construct that is all about your culture. It's about your own prejudices. It's what's inside you, makes you like particular food and clothing and speak particular languages and so on. And we think of race, or more usually nowadays, phenotype, your physical appearance as determined by your genes, as something completely different. But in popular discourse and in journalism, ethnicity is used to mean phenotype. And most people in popular discourse have never heard the term phenotype. And I think we have to be very careful that we may, in an academic discourse, I may be talking to Thomas or Ben and use the word ethnicity, and they all know I'm talking about social construct, but a journalist or a member of the public might think I'm talking about what they call race. And so I think we have to be very clear about our terminology, and we have to try and make other people make those distinctions, because too often they don't. They throw these three things, if you like, phenotype, ethnicity, and also the construct of race, which is sort of an assumption that phenotype determines ethnicity, together under a single bundle. And I think just by being careful with the words amongst ourselves, if we're not making sure the public and the media know what those words mean to us, is problematic.
That's great. Thank you, everyone, for the answers. So I have a direct message from Rory Nesmith, who would like to ask a question in person.
Yes, thank you very much. This is just because I'm doing this on a phone, and it's a bit of a pain to try and type anything of any complexity on a phone. Thank you very much for 3 wonderfully interesting and stimulating papers. The question I have is primarily directed at Alex and Ben, and it's just to develop something you've both alluded to a couple of times, which is the relationship between language and ethnicity, which bears indirectly on indigeneity and origins and so forth. But essentially, does language create peoples, or do peoples create languages in the discourse of this period?
Should I go first, Ben?
Sure, yeah.
I think it varies on different contexts, Rory. So, for example, we're very used in early medieval Britain to thinking of languages effectively making peoples, and the best example of this in some ways is Ben's Britons, the Britones, who were never politically united and are strung out in a very implausible geographical unit that stretches from Dumbarton to Van. And so it wouldn't have been very easy for them to share other things. But I think that may be partly something that's very particular about the context of these islands, because if you go to parts of the world where there's big swathes of dialect continua, so for example, Slavic speaking world or the Romance speaking world, if we think about early medieval Europe, then you can have ethnic identities within them, and they grow up during this period. So in the beginning of late antiquity, and so the 5th and 6th century, people probably did think that in Romance speaking world, the majority of people probably did think they were Romans in some way, and then they were ruled by some minority group who might be called Goths or Franks or Burgundians or something, but might actually end up before very long mostly speaking Romance, a late Latin dialect. But over time, you did get much more distinct ethnic identities around what people sometimes called regnal solidarity, the idea that people from a particular kingdom, whether it's Castile or Burgundy or whatever, who all speak dialects of Romance, which are probably mutually intelligible for most of the Middle Ages, had a distinct ethnic identity. Whereas in Britain, we were in a place where various continua came into direct contact with each other, and that created a sense of a distinct shared identity across languages, because there were 2 kinds of foreigners. There were people in kingdoms that spoke the same language as you, and there were people in kingdoms that spoke different languages to you. Whereas if you're in the middle of the Meseta in 7th century Spain, the likelihood of you ever meeting anyone who doesn't speak Romance is pretty small. And so it's a meaningless category, but you might well cross into another kingdom, but it might be another Romance speaking kingdom, and so on. And the same would be the case in as I say, in Slavic Europe, the area from sort of the Elbe to the Volga. Huge proportion of the population spoke dialects that were only marginally different from each other, but there was no political unity. So I think where you have very different languages that have no level of mutual intelligibility coming up against each other, they become defining features. But where you don't, other things become defining features of ethnicity and polity and political identity. Does that make sense, Ben?
Yes, yes, and I think I would agree with all of that, and particularly the point you made about it being a very particular set of historical circumstances that led to language in early medieval Britain being one of the important defining characteristics of what we might call ethnic groups, and that's not a universal thing. That was much less the case on the continent for various reasons, including some of those Alex has been describing, but came to be so in Britain. I suppose I'd add that was maybe wasn't always the case, and I think maybe that became the case by, say, the end of the 7th or into the 8th century, because we tend to think of the Britons being defined in part by their language, but prior to that point they would have been effectively bilingual, and the further back you go, to the 5th, 4th centuries, a very substantial proportion of them would have spoken Latin, and so, in common with lots of other people in the empire. And so to be a Briton in that context had probably a little bit less to do with Latin and more to do with where you lived. And then during the 5th, 6th, 7th century, increasingly the fact that you were also Christian and that you were not one of the incoming groups from the continent speaking a different language from you, and that's where the language issue, I think, became more of an important factor in identity for the Britons. In terms of indigeneity, I think, you sometimes, of course, see the claim that that Welsh is the oldest language in Britain, which is something that always irritates me a bit, when because of course it's not literally true, when languages are all constantly changing at differing rates, and at least all the languages that we're concerned with go back to Indo-European, so they're all, I suppose, exactly the same age. But what people really mean by that is, I suppose, the language which one can trace back in Britain in terms of its usage for the longest period of time. But even then, languages are constantly changing and quite radically so. And, it's not really the same language. Welsh isn't really the same language at all as the British Celtic of the late Iron Age, but it's part of the discourse of the indigeneity of the Britons and of the Welsh within Britain.
Thank you both for these fascinating answers. We have one more question in the chat from Martin Doyerlein. I might have pronounced that name wrong, so sorry about that. Thank you very much for the presentations. I have a question as well. Isn't it politically dangerous, / does it make sense from a methodological point of view to link genetic groups to archaeological cultures or even to historical groups? And for example, provided a Western steppe herder ancestry to Bell Beagle culture and potentially similar to like Aryans.
Yeah, this is something else that has plagued ancient DNA research to some extent, and particularly the early studies that came out where the geneticists didn't really talk too much to archaeologists and historians in the way that they labeled their sort of genetic ancestries might be misinterpreted. And yeah, particularly if I could go back in time and give them some advice, it's not to use cultural terms in their sort of shorthand idea, nomenclature for genetic ancestries for lots of different reasons. And yeah, since then there's been constant discussions about nomenclature and this sort of stuff. Early European farmer, Western steppe herder ancestry is sort of stuck. But what doesn't come across is that this is often just a convenient way for geneticists to talk about particular types of genetic ancestries. And what a genetic ancestry essentially is a measure of genetic similarity that gives you a sense of recent shared ancestors between either a group of people or two groups or two individuals. So basically these genetic ancestries can exist at any resolution, down to the family level all the way up to sort of a national or a continental level, and like whichever resolution you define it at is more to do with your questions and your research. So it's contextually defined, it's not something sort of intrinsic, but that doesn't often come across in genetics papers because for simplicity, essentially they're often discussed as being these bounded categories with not. I mean, if you talk about genetic ancestors associated with, for instance, the beaker cultures across Britain, sort of the diversity of genetics of people associated with bee cultures across Britain is sort of equivalent to the genetic ancestry we see across the entirety of Europe today. They're massively genetically diverse, more genetically diverse than populations of Europe we typically associate with Europe today. So, you know, as soon as you get into these papers, it becomes obvious that these aren't bounded things, and that ancestries in themselves are themselves mixtures of other ancestries, which are mixtures of other ancestries, which are mixtures of other ancestries. There's no sort of undiluted or sort of essential level of ancestry that we're working with. At the same time, it's difficult when, you know, you get a genetic ancestry change in a country, a significant one like you do, for instance, in Britain in the end of the 3rd millennium BC, where the genetics of people living in Britain seems to change considerably over a few hundred years. It's sort of almost disingenuous then to sort of see the cultural change that happens at the same time, substantial cultural change, and not link the two, given you already have a model of cultural change that could occur as a result of people moving from one place to another and sort of bringing their cultural influences with them. And you know, it would be a massive, you know, and the geneticists themselves aren't trying to say anything about ethnicity particularly or cultural belonging or anything, but when you see a correlation between cultural change and genetic change, I think you're sort of compelled to discuss it, because, you know, doing so is, you know, if you don't discuss it, then a reviewer or someone is going to point it out, or even if you don't discuss it, someone else will, who might not have as benign intentions that you do. That's the problem, is that if you don't talk about it, someone else is going to make this link anyway. So the key is to try and do it in a way that points out the inconsistencies, and again, what you can and can't say about these things. I mean, like I said, the methodological grouping of ancestries is useful from a methodological point of view, but it's important to sort of stress that it's contextually dependent and isn't some absolute definition.
Thank you for that fascinating answer. Any more questions? We have a new message in the chat. Thank you for your answer and perfect pronunciation of the name. So, yeah, are there any more questions in the chat? Otherwise, I can go ahead. Okay, we'll wait for a few more questions. In the meantime, I actually wanted to ask Ben something about history of Britons. So the biblical narrative is very heavily featured in your presentation. I just wanted to ask if that intersects in any way with previous pagan narratives, or if we know if there's any such intersections taking place in the Welsh context.
It would be fascinating to know that, but sadly we just don't have any knowledge of kind of pre-Christian cosmology, as it were, in Britain or Ireland, because the kinds of involved texts that discuss this kind of thing arise very much as a consequence of conversion to Christianity and literacy and education in the Christian context, and then therefore people pondering the place of their own people in the biblical story, because, you know, your early Briton or early Irish person or early Anglo-Saxon reading the early books of the Bible would have immediately wondered where their nation was when they're talking about the sundering of nations across the world, and so that's the kind of question that they pursued and gave rise to many of the early works that we think of as being historical works nowadays. So, but sadly, we can't compare it with anything which came earlier.
The one alternative voice that we have from the early Middle Ages, I think, and Ben may have thought more about this, is that Bede, in his introduction to his Historia Ecclesiastica, he says the Britons came from Armorica, by which he means Northern Gaul. Now, a lot of modern people think that means he's confusing the directionality in which the Britons went, as we saw in some of Ben's texts, to Brittany and created Brittany. But I'm not sure that is what he's saying, because Armorica in late antiquity was a much larger region that stretched over, included most of what we think of as modern Normandy, as well as Brittany and other areas as well. It basically means the land by the sea. It means Atlantic Gaul. And so I wonder whether that's not actually based on classical ideas. Caesar talks about this great similarity between the Gauls and the Britons. So there may have been some little bit of classical learning behind that. And I'm not sure that Armorica is actually used as a synonym for Brittany until much, much later. I'm not sure when the first date of that will be, but
it's the 9th century. I think it's actually in Histoire Bretonne and thereafter that
right.
it becomes a synonym for Brittany rather than the whole thing. I suppose, I mean, in the broader sense of Armorica, where else would they have come from, if not from the north of the northwestern continent?
Well, you're applying common sense here, and I'm not sure that's as you've demonstrated in your own talk. Common sense
Indeed,
isn't necessarily something we can apply. I mean, I'm trying to remember what the Brutus in Geoffrey of Monmouth. He stops at Tours, doesn't he, or somewhere on the way? But he sails to Western Britain and arrives in Devon. So yeah, he bypasses Armorica, but yeah, I mean, but you're right, in practical terms, they're almost certainly going to have come from either Armorica or Belgica.
Thank you both for the answer. So I can't see any questions in the chat. But I do have a question for Thomas. So you mentioned the various ancestry shifts in the history. And this is slightly related to the previous question. Do they match perfectly with the appearance of certain material cultures in Britain, and especially if there's like any regional migrations or changes in population?
No, to some extent. So the genetic change that occurs around 4000 BC is one that's associated with the development of Neolithic farming practices in Britain. So prior to that, you have people living in Britain are largely hunting, fishing, gathering, and a lot of the people who move into Britain still carry on hunting, but they have a agriculturalist, pastoralist aspect to their subsistence, which didn't seem to be in Britain before. And I mean, as happens across the rest of Europe, it seems like their farming lifestyle means that they're able to produce more children than the local population. So it's probably fairly small scale migrations that result in them having a significantly disproportionate genetic impact over hundreds of years. Then yes, but there is in some cases clear evidence for the persistence of the previous population in previous parts of in other parts of Britain as well, particularly Western Scotland, where they carry on with their own lifestyles, and there is interaction between them and the local populations coming in. This is never sort of a totally separate populations who are not interacting at all. There's always sort of interactions where these two populations come into contact. Similarly, at the beginning of the Bronze Age, copper to the Bronze Age in Britain, you have this new population arriving, which is associated with development of beaker cultures, and a lot of the evidence, sort of beaker associated evidence in Britain, comes from the funerary evidence, the graves particularly, and the difficulty in that is that just before these migrations occur, most people in Britain are either cremating their dead or treating them in ways that produce that are archaeologically invisible. So we have hints that essentially you have this again this period where Britain is sort of occupied by at least two populations who are sort of blending together, one that is largely continuous to the previous population, one that is descended from these incomers. But we can only see in the genetics evidence mainly the incomers and their descendants, because they tend to bury their dead, whereas the people who are cremating, the people who we're missing tend to probably cremate the dead. So there is a big cultural change, but it's probably comes across as being bigger than it actually was. to some extent, in that we're missing sort of a significant portion of the population. Then over several hundreds of years, for whatever reason, this incoming population has a much larger genetic legacy than the local population. But then there is, you know, a genetic change, significant genetic shift, particularly in the south of Britain, that happens around 1000, between 1800 BC, where there isn't so much of a huge cultural shift. There are changes, certainly, but previously these changes hadn't been thought to have been produced by any significant migrations of people into Britain. And similarly, you get big changes in other periods culturally that aren't related to migration, particularly the cultural shift in southern Britain that marks the development from the sort of cultures that were building big megalithic tombs to ones that were building stone circles and henges and cremating their dead and making new kinds of pottery. That change occurs without any, in fact, actually in an insular, quite an insular environment where there's seems to be very little contact between people living in Britain and people in continental Europe. So yeah, there are associations, correlations, but they're not by far, but they're clearly not an absolute. And there's lots of mixing and blending at the margins of these interactions.
Thank you. We have time for one more question, and we have one in the chat from Moire. I hope I pronounced the name correctly. Thank you all. Can I ask the speakers to comment on the notion of mixed identity? In particular, was mixed identity something which would have been perceived as such? Presumably, in all cases, identity would have involved a different balance of various characteristics, language, religion, etc. So do we, from a modern perspective, apply the label mixed identity when it might not always have been perceived as such in the early medieval period, or in general?
I think so, to some extent. For example, it's very clear that most sort of described ethnic identities utilize an idea of unilinear descent, so that your membership of a group was usually down to your paternal direct line descent, with a few cases as legally prescribed when it could be taken through the female line if your father was an immigrant, for example, in the case of the Cú Glas that you'll be familiar with more in Ireland. So yes, I think it would be perfectly possible to use the confusion of language that I talked about earlier, to say that using medieval terminology, you could have people who were the same race in that they descended from the same apical figure, but who were phenotypically completely different because it was only their Y chromosome they shared, and they'd had several generations of input from other groups. That being said, obviously things like bilingualism and so on are significant. What I'd be interested to know about, and I can't really think of any texts that talk about this, but we have archaeological evidence that suggests this is happening, is what happens when people shift group in the course of their lifetime, when people born into one ethnic group end up living their adult life in another one, so that they're performing a target ethnicity, but it's not the ethnicity of their upbringing, or at least their small childhood. So I'm thinking here of some of the genetic analysis of so-called Viking graves from the Dublin area, where some of these people have no Scandinavian ancestry, but they're buried in amongst people who do, in a fashion and with clothes and weapons and so on, that suggests they were performing Scandinavianness at the time they died. And it'd be interesting to know how people described them. And my guess is it will be entirely situationally constrained, that it would depend who was asking, where they were asking, what the intent of the question or the imagined intent of the question was, what answers people would give about that person's identity. But maybe Ben has something different to suggest.
Well, I was glad to have that question in the chat there while Tom was answering the previous one, because it allowed time for thinking. I think the best example I can think of in this kind of context of a very elaborately articulated mixed identity would be Gerald of Wales, who explains at great length about how he was both Norman and Welsh, and that was partly down to his ancestry, which he sets out, and he was indeed descended both from Norman and Welsh noble families, but then also, no doubt, a product of the kind of environment in which he grew up in, which was on the one hand, that of a Norman aristocratic household, but it was taking place very much within Wales, which led him to be familiar with Wales in a way that most Norman aristocrats were not. And he was perfectly aware of the mixedness of it, and it was also no doubt situationally invoked, as Alex mentioned, and he says this outright, that he was viewed with suspicion by both groups because he was perceived as being not of them in full, depending on who he was talking to. So I can't think of a commentary to that extent from an earlier period, but one imagines that it certainly did exist. And I think in particular of some of the figures recorded in the charters, in the Llandaf charters for the 10th and 11th centuries, where you can see in single families mixtures of Old English and Welsh names being used, particularly in Gwent, so it's right on the border there with England. I'm sure that the people that they interacted with on a day-to-day basis would have known that Athelbecht was an English name, whereas Ithel was a Welsh name, and yet these were people, kind of minor nobles essentially, who were happy to name their children with either name. And we can only guess what language they spoke or how they would have identified themselves had they been traveling around further within England or Wales. But one imagines that they might have had an experience not dissimilar from Gerald's a few centuries later. So I'm sure it existed, if only we could see it more often in the earlier period.
Yeah, I was just going to say quickly, we have to be careful of this with the genetic evidence, because that people wouldn't have understood their genetic ancestries, and well, obviously they can't see their own genetics. Obviously, in that period, no one had their 23andMe results back then, and then even if they did have a sense of their family history, the way that they understood that might have been totally different to the way that we understand that today. And I think the best example of this is the recent finds of the Anglo-Saxon burials from Kent. Well, one Anglo-Saxon burial from Kent. One seems to be more of a sort of a British context from Dorset, where these individuals were buried in the cemetery in exactly the same way as everybody else, but they had significant proportions of ancestry from West Africa, and so they clearly, at least in their identity as it was expressed in the funerary treatment, was sort of the same as everybody else, but had quite in their histories. So they had both of them, I think, probably had a grandfather that was that had ancestries from West Africa. So yeah, and again, you look at their ancestry, you would call them potentially mixed ancestries of some description, but clearly, culturally speaking, their identity was not mixed at all. It was very much one thing or the other.
Thank you, everyone. So we're just in time for the end of the session. So first and foremost, I would like to thank our speakers for their presentations. They were very fascinating. They were very interesting and very thought-provoking. I would also like to thank our audience for taking the time to join us and sharing their questions. Please keep an eye out on our website and YouTube channel to watch and share the recording of today's event. To learn more about our upcoming events and to register for them, please visit our Crash webpage or our Crash website, and the links will be posted in the chat. To get involved or give us feedback and suggestions for future events, please write us at the email IDs posted in the chat. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Christos, for organising it.
Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks.